you sure?
Yeah.
What are you looking at? The wall behind me or me?
No, straight in your eyes.
Okay.
Full attention, undivided.
So I'm Justice Gonzalez. I'm a youth ambassador. Who's a youth ambassador? And I need to introduce to you Matt Shea. According to him, he's a 10-year veteran. And then one day he woke up and he's like, somebody's got to do something. And I should probably do it. And then he went back to sleep, according to him. And then he couldn't sleep, so it was probably not very nourishing sleep. Anyway, I'd like to introduce you Matt Shea.
Thank you. Thanks, I appreciate it. All right, is this on or no? We good? How about now? Check. All right, well, you can hear me anyways because I'm loud and obnoxious, so. Do I? All right, I will use the normal mic. How's everybody doing? Great? Amazing? Well, I was a dude that spent 10 years in the Army and woke up one day and said, somebody's got to do something, and it's got to be me, because nobody else was doing anything. So I became a state representative in Washington State. I've been there for 10 years, fighting in a battle that is now spilling over into Idaho. Some of the downtown Seattle politics is. But one of the things that I heard a lot was, America is not a Christian country. We're not. And I'm going to prove that to you tonight and why that's important, and also talk a little bit about Christian leadership. Because it's important to understand what our foundation is so that if we have a good grounding, we know where we're going in the future. Does that make sense to everybody? You got to know what your history is, what your past is. So I'm going to leave you with a statement. The existence of truth proves the existence of God. That's kind of existential, but that's all right. It is a very deep thought. But America is a Christian nation, and the problem that we have today is people love to pray, but nobody really likes to do anything. And this is from Barna. You can see over here, 75% like to pray. When it gets down to attending small groups, volunteering at church, it's down to about 20% or less. I'm going to stop there. Some of you have heard this story before. An author, Oliver DeMille, tells it, and I'm going to retell it tonight. So there's a graduation, and the dean of a university invites a speaker to the graduation. The speaker gets up on stage, and he says, how many of you are going to change the world? Raise your hand. About 6 hands, just like now, raised. And he says, you 6, come on down to the front. So these 6 kind of scared kids go down to the front. And he puts the chairs on the stage in a circle, and he sits down, turns his back to the audience, and starts talking to them right at graduation. Well, the crowd starts murmuring and is saying, what's going on? The murmuring grows louder and louder. Speaker gets back up, goes to the podium, and says, hey, can you all keep it down? I want to talk to the 6 people who are going to change the world. Thank you very much. Turns his back to him, sits down. Pretty soon, people just start leaving. And finally, the only one left is the dean who invited him and the people up on the stage. So the dean comes up on the stage, and he's kind of trying to listen into their conversation, and the speaker turns around to him and says, did you raise your hand? Can you leave us alone? I want to talk to 6 people who are going to change the world. Thank you. And he starts talking to him. There's a moral to that story. First of all, you have to have the courage to raise your hand. The second moral to that story is it takes a minority to change the world, and it always has. It never takes a majority. It takes the 20% who are going to go and volunteer at church, or go on the mission field, or go into business, or go into accounting, or go into a science, that are actually going in there with the intent that that is the calling God has given them to change the world. So how many of you are going to change the world? That's pretty good. Do you believe it? If we believe what we believe is really real, God will change the world through each one of us if we believe what we believe is really real. That's pretty profound, isn't it? Every single one of you can change the world. You just have to believe it. and allow the Lord to work through you to do it. There's a lot of folks who say that the answer today is political. Some say that the answer is economic. Others will say that we just need a great conservative fighter as president. I would submit to you that what we lack today is God at the center of our country. That is the solution. Now, I want to talk today about our American system, but it's important to start there. Because what happens when Christians actually get involved in political problems? I want to share a story with you. I went to Ethiopia back in November, and I drove 7 hours from the capital, Addis Ababa, into the interior to a place called Nekemte. 3 days before I got there, there was a gigantic gun battle between two warring Christian tribes that had been fighting for a while. They've been killing each other and burning each other's businesses out. And they had this gun battle. Government troops came in, Ethiopian army, and they put it down. A bunch of people were killed. Our advance team that was going in there with our ministry saw shell casings still on the streets, laying there on the streets. So we get there, and the Ethiopian army had declared a truce for 3 days while our ministry was in that town. That's pretty scary when you're a former soldier going overseas without a weapon going into a place like that, let me tell you, okay? It's disconcerting. We go there. The second night we're there, the wealthiest guy in town who owned the hotel we were staying in, and hotel, okay, is in quotation marks, all right? There was no toilet seat. There was orange, I don't know what, growing in the corner of the shower. There were burned out electrical sockets. Okay? This was the best hotel in town. So we went to his house and he said, hey, do you guys understand that the day you leave, the war is starting again? And that's the question I kind of hear today. Politics is so bad, why get involved? It's so dirty, why get involved? Well, there's the rest of the story. So the next day, the third day, these two warring Christian tribes came together, and they worshiped together in the tens of thousands in that square. And my pastor stood on the stage, Pastor Andre, and he said, whatever the devil has for this area is broken in Jesus' name. And he told the pastors later that day there's going to be peace. And they're kind of looking at him like, you've been in America too long, whatever. But the next morning, as we were driving out and leaving, our local contact got a phone call in the back seat. I looked back at him, and he looked like he's just stunned. And he said they just declared peace for the first time in 10 years. And that peace is held to this day. Because Christians showed up in a political situation with the solution, Jesus Christ. I tell you that story because why aren't we doing that here in America? Why aren't we doing that here in America? Now, what happens when Christianity fails? I'm going to give you a few examples. The first is from Bosnia. When I was in Bosnia, they had just had the Olympics there in 1996 or whatever it was, in Sarajevo. 5 years later, I'm standing over a mass grave where there's a bunch of people that have been killed by their neighbors because politics failed. The OSS was the precursor to the CIA, and they wrote a report after World War II. How is it possible that in an ostensibly Christian country that there could have been the Holocaust? And this is what came out of that study. The destruction of Christianity was explicitly recognized as a purpose of the National Socialist movement. Then, under the pretext that churches themselves were interfering in political and state matters, they would deprive the churches step by step of all opportunity to affect German public life. This was the lead intelligence agency of the United States of America saying that the cause of the Holocaust in Germany was that the German government pulled the churches out of politics successfully. And then the quote from Bonhoeffer. There's another quote that most people haven't heard of where he says, there is no safety for an honest man except to believe all possible evil of evil men as well. And the point is that if we're not getting involved, evil will get involved. And it's going to be a very bad end if it does. So 3 rules to always remember, especially in politics. Evil always lies in an attempt to create division. Evil always doubles down on the lie, and evil always projects. Let me give you an example of projection. If somebody projects onto you that perhaps you were colluding with the Russians, you probably were the one that was colluding with the Russians. It's an example of projection. If they try to say, you're the hater, you're the violent one, you're probably the hater and the violent one. Okay? That's projection. They're putting onto you how they are themselves. And in the last few years, we've seen a massive increase in attacks on Christians and religious liberty here in America. And I want to give you a specific example of that. You see this sticker right here? See a sticker on my computer? I don't care, CAIR, Council of American Islamic Relations. Unindicted co-conspirator in the largest terror financing trial ever successfully prosecuted in the United States of America. I got hauled into the chief clerk's office because they thought that was discriminatory. And then they said, what does this Bible verse down here mean? Luke 10:19. What does that mean? Well, that's where Jesus gave us authority over all the power of the evil one. And then I just stared at him. And the point with that is, if it can happen to me, it's going to happen to you too, unless you stand up now and fight. So let's talk about America being a Christian nation. If you're taking notes, you want to write this down because this is not taught in a lot of schools, but it is taught in homeschools. God bless homeschools. May 19th, 1643, the Articles of Confederation of the United Colonies. This was the very first line, whereas we all came into these parts of America with one and the same end and aim, namely to advance the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ and to enjoy the liberties of the gospel and purity with peace. Why is that important? This was the first founding document that united the colonies together, and that was the first line saying this is the purpose. How many of you have ever heard of that before? Raise your hand. 4. Now you all have. Then, in 1765 through 1769, a guy named Sir William Blackstone, remember that name? William Blackstone wrote his commentaries on the laws of England. And in those commentaries, he defined the law of nature and the law of nature's God. The law of nature being God's will or truth written into creation, and the law of nature is God being Holy Scripture. So when Thomas Jefferson wrote it in the Declaration of Independence, the law of nature and the law of nature's God, what he was saying is, we are basing our country, soon to be, on the principles of the Bible and God's will and God's truth. The so-called atheist or deist Thomas Jefferson. In fact, the commentaries on the laws of England were used as a law book for over 150 years. Now, it's also interesting that back during the founding era, there were a couple things that were said. April 18, 1775. How many of you knew that the Revolutionary War in America started on a church lawn? A couple? That's a pretty important thing, isn't it? To the context. And this is what was said. We recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus. So in other words, they're saying that we didn't recognize the English king, we recognize Jesus as king. Now, there are some folks that say the Bible says you need to obey the authorities, and I want to kind of hit that head on. Specifically, Romans 1:32 said that if you break God's law, there should be a punishment for it. But more importantly, Romans 13 says that you need to obey the governing authorities. And the Greek there, hyperkouses, means higher authority or authority above. In other words, God is always above any governmental authority. So, for example, if the government of the United States passes a law today that says you have to go kill your neighbor, you can say, no, I obey God's law above this law. Does that make sense of why that is there? Now, if the German government created a law back in the 1930s that said you need to turn in your Jewish neighbors, and you said, well, but I need to obey the authorities, I guess I'm going to have to do that? Or would it be more correct, would it be right to say, no, actually God's law is higher, I'm not going to do that? Does that make sense? So it's not determined by who is in power, as it were, who is in control, because you guys learned that earlier. It is important of who is the highest authority, Jesus Christ. Many people also don't know that the 13 colony constitutions required a belief in Christianity. I want to go through this very quickly. Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, South Carolina, New Hampshire, and North Carolina all required a belief in God, Jesus, or the Protestant faith. Connecticut and New York acknowledged Christian law. Virginia said it's a mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. This is written in their constitutions. And then Rhode Island, in the true Christian faith and worship of God, they may defend themselves in their just rights and liberties against all enemies of the Christian faith. The original colonies had these in their constitutions. That's the Massachusetts Constitution. And I just want to highlight the bottom part there where it says, "And no subject shall be hurt, molested, or restrained in his person, liberty, or estate for worshiping God in the manner and season most agreeable to the dictates of his own conscience." Why is that important? Because last week in Spokane, Washington, a teacher was fired for saying that drag queens reading in a public library is wrong. Off hours outside of her workplace. And going all the way back, this is why that protection was in place. Here's a few founding fathers, just to cite these. The general principles on which the founding fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. That's John Adams. Providence has given to our people the choice of our rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of a Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers. John Jay, the first Supreme Court Justice. Then Thomas Jefferson, again the supposed deist, who says, "We all agree in the obligation of the moral principles of Jesus, and nowhere will they be found delivered in greater purity than in his discourses." It's a little bit different history than gets taught in some public schools. But then, in the 1840s, a guy named Karl Marx started to write. And Karl Marx was very anti-Christian. He started to write, and so the question came up in America, are we really a Christian nation? So the 33rd U.S. Congress actually took this up as a question and did an official investigation into whether we're a Christian nation or not. And they came out with two reports, one from the House and one from the Senate. The Senate report from Senator George Badger, quote, "We are a Christian people. We shall pay due regard to Christianity." The next year, Representative Meacham came out with his report where he said every colony did sustain religion in some form. Had the people during the Revolution had a suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. So as a matter of official congressional investigations and findings, they discovered and found officially that we are a Christian nation. Then, a little bit later, a guy named Charles Darwin started writing, and Charles Darwin prompted the questions again in the United States. So the United States Supreme Court, in the Holy Trinity case, took up the matter, are we a Christian nation? And here is what they ruled. This is a religious people, this is a Christian nation. These and many other matters which might be noticed add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances that this is a Christian nation, period. As a matter of fact and law, the United States Supreme Court ruled that we are a Christian nation. So, the founding documents, the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Supreme Court, but if that is not enough, one other quote. One of the things we were asked to look into was what accounted for the success, in fact, the preeminence of the West all over the world. We studied everything we could from the historical, political, economic, and cultural perspective. At first, we thought it was because you had more powerful guns. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. Next, we focused on your economic system. But in the last 20 years, we realized that the heart of your culture is religion, Christianity. We don't have any doubt about this. The atheist, communist, Chinese government did an official study in 2002, and that was the result. Even, I'm speaking of the Chinese government at this point, even our enemies know that we're a Christian nation. And this is still being argued. So let's talk about the role of government. What is the source of law? Now, this is interactive. What is the source of law? Is it man or God? What's the source of law? Shout it out. God. Because if it's not, which man? That guy? God help us. Trump? Well, he makes mistakes too. Who? If it's a man, that man? Who is this right here? Stalin. Who's that? Mao. Two of the greatest mass murderers in the history of the world. Who's this? That's Muhammad. That man? I prefer that one. Which God? Well, we just answered that. For our country, it was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whose son is Jesus the Christ. And that's why we chose that. The purpose of government, unalienable rights, can only be taken away in two instances, through death or acquiescence. And it is the role of government to protect those rights. Now, I want to stop there. It is the role of the governmental structure to protect those rights, the role of the governing to protect those rights. Both are actually set up to help protect those rights. The other interesting part, too, is you see a lot of people who say, is that all there is? No, it's to punish evil and protect the righteous. Government structure, but more importantly, the governing, will protect the righteous by punishing criminals, right? Could you imagine if you walked down the street and it was like Somalia out there right now? You wouldn't feel very protected. What if all of a sudden a government bureaucrat showed up and said, you know, that property that you owned for 3 generations, that's no longer yours. But isn't that a little bit the same thing? Freedom is the ability to live life your own way, and liberty is the ability to live life God's way. That's the way I define it. But think about that. Instead of using the word freedom as much, use the word liberty. So let's talk about types of governmental structure. Governmental control, 0 or 100%. Now, these are categorizations that I use. When I sit down and talk to other people and they've categorized these things differently, we still agree on the basic tenets. First, you have total government control, or monarchy, rule of one. And it's important that with rule of one, it never really ever happens. It's always a group of people that are helping one person. Okay, so there really isn't truly that, and apparently that's not, there we go. Then you have rule of none, which is anarchy, and you'll see oligarchies rule by group. So there's always a group of people that will put somebody forward, okay? Man, this is sticking for some reason. All right, well, I'm just going to continue to go. There's another type or form of governmental structure. It's called democracy. Do we live in a democracy? No. Do we live in a democracy? No. Okay, democracy comes from the word demos kratian, which means people rule or mob rule. And the founding fathers specifically guarded against a democracy because 51% or 50.01% could vote away the rights of everybody else. That's not what they wanted. In fact, democracy can't be found in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, or the Constitution of the 50 states. And I've heard people use the word democracy on the floor of the House of Representatives, and I will stand up and say, Mr. Speaker, as a point of parliamentary clarification, we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic. And they get all upset about it, but I try to do it every time they bring it up. Because, as John Adams said, democracy never lasts long, it soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. So this is very key, that democracies always try to destroy private property rights and personal security. In fact, Karl Marx actually said that, and I'll get to that here in a little bit. So democracy really is ruled by mob. And this thing is sticking again. Boy, I don't know what the deal is. But the rule that we live in is a republic, or res publica, the public thing in Latin, which means rule of law, so that no matter who is the governing, there is always law that they are accountable to. Nobody is above the law. I want to give you an example here in Washington, or actually over in Washington State that happened. There was an initiative passed by the people, and that initiative effectively took away the firearms rights of almost every citizen in practice. It made people liable. If they left their gun out and somebody stole their gun and used it in a crime, they would be liable for that crime even though they didn't commit it. So there were sheriffs over in Washington State who said, we're not going to enforce that because we took an oath to the Constitution as required by the Constitution, and therefore we are not going to enforce this unconstitutional law. Dozens, actually, have now done it across the country. And this is a flashpoint. We're going to see this in the future, but the bottom line is they believe that the Constitution, the oath that they took to it, should trump. And it did. Right now, in Washington State, they're trying to seize firearms and do confiscation. This is very important because if we don't understand we live in a republic, we understand we live in a democracy, then there is no fighting back. Actually, I'm going to back up here. Specifically right there, without law there can be no freedom, or more importantly, or more correctly, there can be no liberty. So let's talk about a free market economy. So and some folks get a little upset at these definitions, that's okay. All economies are capitalist. All economies are capitalist. The question is always who owns and controls the capital. So when you ask that question, there really is only two options. You have the free market, where capital is owned and controlled privately, and then you have all the others where capital is either owned by somebody else, or it's controlled by somebody else, or a combination of the two. Does that make sense? All right. It's very important to understand that, because do we truly have private property rights today? I want you to think about that for a second. So let's talk about these different economic systems. Like I said, free market capitalism has ownership and control privately. And apparently that thing is going to stick again, my goodness. Then, on top of that, you have what is called, as an economic system, fascism. Fascism is ownership by the state, by private individuals, but control over the method, the means, and the output by the state. Fascism actually came from Italy, came from a guy named Benito Mussolini, who was actually a socialist. And I'll get to that here in a second. But specifically, Benito Mussolini said, we need to allow private ownership, but we got to control everything we can. Does that sound like today a little bit? Then you have National Socialism, where the German ruling party, the Nazis, the National Socialists, said, hey, we need to take fascism and go another step. We need to have state ownership of some things. So, industry for making war machines, and the Volkswagen. Did you know that? The Volkswagen was made by the German government at one time. You have businesses like car makers and other war machine type industries that are controlled and owned by the government. Socialism. State ownership of key industries to control the whole economy. So you'll see this, for example, trying to control the media, saying that there is a, for example, national public radio, or that there is a socialized thing like Pravda, which is a socialist media outlet during the former Soviet Union. They try to control more than the National Socialists, and the communists are the most honest. They just own and control everything. So So let's talk about fascism. This term is thrown around today. It's particularly thrown against the right, what they call the right. I would call constitutional conservative Christians. But it's important to know that Benito Mussolini was actually the chief editor of the PSI paper Avanti, and that name of that paper was called Forward. Now, where did we see Forward as a slogan? Now things start to make a little bit more sense. Benito Mussolini, as a socialist, then adopted fascism as an economic model to bring the socialists forward. That's what he said. Now, what president in modern times nationalized car makers? Anybody know? That guy right there. What president in modern times nationalized the healthcare system? That guy right there. And he used the same slogan as Mussolini. There's nothing new under the sun. These are the same old ideas. All right, let's go to property rights as a foundation. As man is said to have a right to his property, he may also equally said to have a property in his rights. And that's important because your life, your person and your labor, your liberty, your thoughts, your conscience and expression, and your property, real land or personal things, if you control that and you own it, guess what you have? Freedom, liberty. Because if I have my own property and I can create wealth out of it, I can fight against those that are trying to take it away. But if I take away your ability to create wealth, you can no longer resist, can you? Because you have no wealth to do anything with. That's what's so insidious. Every dollar comes out of the ground or the air or the water, and if you look at the radical environmentalists, they are trying to stop you from taking a dollar out of the ground or the air or the water in every possible way. But also, and this is why the Founding Fathers said that our form of government, our economy was only made for a moral and religious people because of Deuteronomy 8:17. Private property must be owned and controlled with humility. This is what the Lord said. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me, but remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth. And then, obviously, in the Ten Commandments, property rights are preserved. You shall not steal and you shall not covet, right? Why do I bring that up today? Because you can have a free market system, but you can't really have a free market system unless you have morality behind it. You can't. Let's talk about private property and the four aspects of it. Title, or proof of ownership. Use, which is very simple, when and where. Control, how and what. And the ability to sell or dispose or discard of it. Now I want to take an example. A car. Okay, let's say you own a car. Can you sell a car right now without going through the state? Okay, say that louder.
No.
No. What do you have to do? You have to do the title through the state, the taxes, okay? How about can you use your car wherever you want to and whenever you want to? Really? You can? Are there places in the national forests that you can't go, that are blocked off?
Yes.
Okay, so you can't. Can you drive when the road is closed? No. Control how or what you use your car for. Can you use your car as a battering ram if you want to?
Nope.
Depends on if you're on your own property or on a public road, doesn't it? But the fact of the matter is, if you go down this list, we truly don't have private property ownership today. We just don't. And one of the biggest places we don't is with property taxes, which is effectively you will lose your property if you don't pay the king or the government, right? In 1878, in the Washington State Constitution, the original Washington State Constitution, they actually abolished property taxes. They had no property taxes. And we're trying to bring that back with Liberty State, but that's a separate presentation. Let's go to the roots of communism, which are evil. Now, I'm going to go through some things that are a little disturbing. That's okay. because we need to see this. This is hidden today from a lot of us. How many of you knew that Karl Marx wrote a book called A World Without Jews? How many of you knew that in the KGB headquarters in Moscow they had a shrine to anti-Semitism? How many of you knew that? Communism is rooted, socialism is rooted in evil. Karl Marx was evil, and I will show you that here in a second. First, Saul Alinsky, one of the modern Marxists, IAF is the Industrial Areas Foundation, dedicated his book, Rules for Radicals, to Lucifer in the very front page. You can actually read that. Okay? You can go read it for yourself. Karl Marx wrote in 2 books of poetry these lines: I wish to avenge myself against the one, capital O, who rules above, on that being that enthroned Lord, capital L. And then even more pointedly, thus heaven I forfeited, he's saying that. Thus heaven he's forfeited, he knows it full well, his soul once true to God is chosen for hell. He wrote that as poetry. Just basically saying he's evil, in his own words. And an entire system that killed more people, times 10, than any other system in the history of the world, is rooted in this guy. And also this guy, a guy named Charles Darwin. How many of you knew that the original book, The Origin of the Species, was called The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection for the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life? It was a racist publication. And in fact, it goes even deeper with him. He wrote later in The Descent of Man, pages 102 and 103, that quote, and I'm not going to read it because it is pretty disturbing, except for the bottom part: the break will be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as the baboon, instead of us at present, between the Negro or the Australian and the gorilla. That is a racist statement in Charles Darwin. And both of those men are the founding principal pillars of Marxism, socialism in America today. And most people don't know these even exist. So to sum it up, it is a constant struggle between an atheist, pagan, state-controlled oligarchy and a Judeo-Christian free market country. That's republic, that's what we mean. That's what we are. That's what we're facing. The struggle is that simple. So let's talk briefly about Christian leadership and government. These are 3 things that I use as questions on almost every bill. Will it violate God's commandments? How does it further the preaching of the gospel? Is it constitutional? Will it violate natural law? Could you imagine if we had every legislator in the country using that? There wouldn't be Republican or Democrat. There would just be, here's the Constitution, here's our Judeo-Christian foundations, here's the truth. Let's do the right thing. Which in most cases should be nothing, right? It really should be nothing. You guys understand that? And if you don't, you can talk to Heather Scott. Okay. One thing that if you don't take anything out of this presentation, take this out. Throughout your whole life, don't read what somebody says something says. Read the primary source document. So don't read a book about what the Constitution says. Go read the Constitution. Don't read a book about what the Declaration of Independence says. Go read the Declaration of Independence. Don't read a book about what the Bible says. Go read the Bible. Because too often things get spun or twisted. Go read the primary source document and confront and love it every step of the way. And I really want to bring that kind of to a head with something that happened up in Spokane here last week. If somebody's yelling and screaming at you, do you listen to them? I'm just asking, do you listen to them? No? I don't either. If somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I really care about you, and I really care about your future, and I really care about your schooling and just everything that you're doing, and you might want to consider doing it a different way, because the way you're headed is not going to end well, I might listen to that person, right? So confronting in love, you're not yelling and screaming at people, but you are appealing to their reason and the fact that you care about them before you tell them what you tell them. Be quick to forgive and slow to anger. Love our neighbor. Don't let government do it for us. How many of you are involved in ministry? Raise your hand. How many of you have ever gone out and fed the homeless? Raise your hand. How many of you ever visited people in prison? Raise your hand. Keep it up. Okay? That's loving your neighbor. That's going out and doing those things. And if we did that more, we wouldn't have the problems that we typically have today with homelessness and all these things in cities. Now, some of it is accountability on those folks, but Christians have abdicated their role to love their neighbors and given that role to government. Jesus Christ said we're supposed to love our neighbors, not let government do it for us. Do you see how that works against us? All right. And then last, I've got a couple. I want to go through a couple of these. We all know Jesus is the perfect example of leadership. Leadership is not the ability to compromise, it's the ability not to. I want to get to this one, though. Go ahead and read that. Every morning that you get up and you're praying and you're reading and you're talking, just stop for a second and ask God, what do you want me to do today? Lord, what would you want me to do today? Don't let ambition or your thought of what you need to be doing take over, because ambition becomes the greatest pitfall in politics particularly, but in every area of life. That we need to avoid that ambition and do what God's calling us to do. I want to talk about the last two things. So my family motto is Vincit Veritas, which means truth conquers. And the idea behind that is that we always have to get the truth out there, and eventually the truth will prevail. But sometimes we need help. Sometimes it's perseverance. Sometimes it's just sticking it out when people are railing at you and yelling at you and the media is saying things and everything is against you and negative against you, and just staying on that same line. I was put into a terrorist publication internationally here about 3 months ago. I started receiving death threats, started receiving things at my house, started receiving things against my family. And I'm not saying that as a woe's me thing. What I'm saying is I could have let that distract me, but instead I kept on mission and just took it as a badge of honor that people were taking those kind of shots. Now, I don't know if you know what it's like to walk outside your house and not know if somebody's waiting outside for you that day. But if you're focusing on the Lord, what do you want me to do today, God? Doesn't really matter. You can walk outside your house without any sort of fear that somebody's going to do something to you. And if you are entering a generation and a time when that is going to happen to you, and you need to think about what you're going to do ahead of time. Some of you may have already seen it in school. Some of you may have already seen it in business for the adults back in the back of the room, or in politics. Choose what you're going to do ahead of time. Because post tenebris lux, or after darkness light, that is always our great hope. So Wolverine leadership. And I want to share a war story too real quick about trusting in the Lord. So I'm leaving Iraq for the last time. Okay, I'm driving down the Baghdad International Airport road to Baghdad International Airport from the Green Zone. It is the last day in country, the last day for me in a war zone. I'm excited to go home, but I'm also a little concerned because it's the most dangerous road in the entire country that we're going down. And as we're driving down the road, two little kids ran right out in the middle of the road, right in front of our Humvees. And the driver turns around and he looks at me and he says, "Sir, what do we do?" Meaning, do I run them over or do I stop? Because if you stop in Iraq on that road, you get ambushed and you die. So what did I do? I prayed, "Lord, what do you want me to do?" Very clearly, very still, small voice, "Stop." So I looked at the driver, I said, "Stop." He said, "Sir." I said, "Stop." Slammed on his brakes. Little kids ran up. A friend of mine who taught himself the Baghdadi dialect of Arabic gets out, runs up to him, starts talking to him. And they're pointing down the road. He comes back up, he says, "Sir, there's an ambush about 100 yards down the road." And now we're really nervous, right? Last day in country, there's an ambush 100 yards down the road, a football field down the road. Thank God we didn't run over the little kids. So we get back in the Humvee, we start driving down there, prepared for a fight. And between the time when we stopped, that 3 minutes when we stopped, a small tank came in the other direction, and they decided to ambush the small tank called the Bradley Fighting Vehicle. And that Bradley Fighting Vehicle took the threat out. And we drove to the airport, and I went home, and was home 24 hours later. Wow. That's trusting the Lord. Why aren't we doing that in politics? Why aren't we doing that in our businesses? Why aren't we doing that in every area of our lives? It's the same every day. Every single day. So let's talk about Wolverine leadership. Wolverines have a lot to teach us about leadership. They've done studies about it. Some of you may have heard this before, but you're going to hear it again because I love Wolverine leadership. They've done studies on Wolverines and found out that Wolverines always run 3 miles an hour. Uphill, downhill, flat ground, mud, snow, doesn't matter, 3 miles an hour. In fact, they tracked one Wolverine going up 4,500 vertical feet at 3 miles an hour. That's a tired Wolverine when he gets to the top, right? 3 miles an hour. What does that teach us? In life, we should be running 3 miles an hour. We shouldn't just sprint into a situation and then, okay, we're done. Like the vaccine issue, right? We need to be doing it at 3 miles an hour. Next thing that Wolverines teach us is self-sufficiency. During the wintertime, there's avalanches, and they will cover an animal in snow, and Wolverines will dig down sometimes 14 feet to get down to that animal and then eat the entire thing, including the bones. In some native languages, they're translated as bone crushers. What does that teach us? That we need to be self-sufficient as well, that things aren't always going to be given to us, that we need to work for them, but rely on the Lord to fill in the gaps. Wolverines also teach us about parenthood or mentorship. They've tracked Wolverine fathers, and they discovered that Wolverine dads spend almost exactly the same amount of time with each one of the pups. It's amazing. So are we doing that? And this is for the wiser members of the audience here that are crowned with wisdom. Who are you mentoring? Wow, you don't understand. Pick somebody. I do understand. It might not be a relative. It might be a neighbor. I don't know. Pick somebody to mentor to pass on freedom and liberty and those ideas to the next generation. And lastly, Wolverines teach us about proper attitude. They actually have videos of Wolverines playing fetch like a dog. They make this little squealing sound. And it doesn't fit my image of a Wolverine, but they're playing fetch with these things, and they're very playful animals. But if you attack a Wolverine's family, it will rip your face off or die trying. So the question then is, how many times have our families been attacked, our community's been attacked, our business has been attacked? And we've just said this, I'm glad it wasn't me. Glad it wasn't me. Instead of, hey, they attacked my neighbor, I'm going to go stand with my neighbor shoulder to shoulder. And I'll end with this story with Representative Heather Scott. That happened 3 years ago. We got a phone call. Heather Scott got a phone call. Hey, they're trying to take the guns of one of our veterans. He had a stroke. They marked a box on his medical form that said he couldn't do his own finances, and so therefore he couldn't own firearms. And they were coming to take his guns. So Heather called me, We got some pastors together, got the local county sheriff, and we went and stood on that veterans lawn and we waited for the Veterans Administration folks to show up. TV cameras everywhere. Veteran Administration guy gets out of his car, and I walked up to him, and cameras and pictures are being taken. I shook his hand. I said, "Hey, you don't mind if we wait outside and we talk out here, do you? Because you're not going in that house today." Sounds like a good idea, Representative. And what happened when we stood up for that guy was that 2 days later, the doctor, without ever seeing him again, magically said, "You are now well enough to keep your firearms," and they left him completely alone. And every other veteran in that area of the state. That is what it means to stand up when your neighbor is attacked. That is Wolverine leadership, and that is what we need to be in this next generation in the fight that's coming in this country. I want to thank you guys for hearing me out today. I know some of it might have gone over your heads, but you caught most of it. And I want you to know, too, that it's going to be your generation that turns this country back in the right direction. Embrace that, okay? I believe in you. Love you guys. Thank you, and God bless, okay? Right on time. How's it? Very good. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.